healthcare. And for that aim, nice to welcome so many lovely people back. You are joined by Mark Sangster, Principal Evangelist and VP Industrial Security Strategies at eSentire, Anahi Santiago, CISO at Christiana Care Health System, and Dave Stewart, an executive at Silverline. Take it away. It's a very, very hot topic.
Absolutely, and obviously healthcare is very very pertinent and very relevant to all of us, in these COVID times, and I think it's keeping all of us on our toes. A lot of things happening in healthcare, and the industry is transitioning, partly as a result of the changes with COVID, but there's been a change and an evolution that's been going on for quite some time. And I want to start by asking Dave, our resident healthcare, or one of our resident healthcare SMEs here, to talk us through what's actually been happening, Dave, in healthcare with regard, to digital interoperability, AI, innovation, and automation.
Well, I think the pandemic has just reiterated the significance of digitization, really in everything we do, but especially in healthcare. It's had a huge impact in accelerating digitization and, improved digital consumer experiences, being able to communicate and segment the population and be able to communicate real time, from setting up the nurse triage centers to be able to work with organizations, in communities, to scheduling using a lightweight, elegant scheduler to be able to manage, that whole process with distribution of the vaccines. But, looking back at healthcare and trying to do more with less in this day and age, we've got the workforce that data is very important. What we're trying to do with AI data and do more with less, setting up these command centers, throughout different departments within hospitals and care facilities, and being able to leverage various pockets of data to really make sense of what we're trying to do. You're seeing more and more, of course, we live on Zoom now, but especially with teledoc and, being able to have the telemedicine and changes with reimbursement in healthcare, that it's much more adopted from the care providers as well as the community to be able to seek care and utilize healthcare services.
Yeah, these are certainly very interesting times. I want to throw the gauntlet over to Anahi. Anahi, you're CISO of a large healthcare system here. What are you seeing, in terms of boots on the ground? How has Christiana Care handled the the COVID crisis, and how has that impacted your evolution towards digital interoperability that's been ongoing for quite some time? I know.
How much time do we have? Wow, that's quite a loaded question. Hard to answer because there's so much. We've always been a digital forward healthcare system with the belief that, and we say this over and over again, if care can be delivered in the home, it will be consumed in the home. If care can be delivered over digital means, it will be consumed over digital means. And so that has been our mantra way before COVID, in terms of, we recognize that the way to transform healthcare and the way to remain competitive in a very consumer-focused, transformational healthcare industry, we really need to ensure that technology is at the forefront of everything that we do. And so when COVID hit, we really already had many of the pillars in place in order to be able to pivot very quickly, and transform our virtual care practice from a single practice to over 95% of primary care practices within a month being able to deliver healthcare. The remote work, the push to remote work was pretty easy for us because we sort of had this mantra of access from anywhere at any time from any device, and had the infrastructure in place to be able to facilitate that. So we didn't really blink. The push around last March was really around, how can we now use the technology and the mechanisms that we already have in place to enable our patients to be able to communicate with caregivers without having to have physical contact, or to be able to communicate with their family members. when no visitors were allowed. And then we started to think about how do we keep positive patients at home that don't need to be hospitalized while being able to use technology in order to help them with their care while they were at home. And how can we leverage the FCC grant in order to provide cell phones to underserved areas so that we can continue to use telehealth and use apps in order to further that care. And that type of thinking was already there, but it sort of became a realization with the push to move everything to remote. And now that things have sort of come back into the facilities and things have become a little bit normal, we haven't taken our foot off the gas pedal in terms of adopting technology, continuing to look at medical devices, apps, other cloud-based technology that we can really use to push the care still out to the home and into the communities. And so the use of automation in terms of bots and machine learning and efforts to really be able to translate what's happening in the home into medical records and into care delivery workflows that make sense in this new world have been at the forefront of everything that we're doing. And I just, it's an interesting time to be a CISO because a lot of this technology and these use cases and these workflows really haven't been tested. And so as we pave the way into this journey, I'm used to tapping into my peers. And I suspect that in the future, they'll be tapping into me because we're doing these things a little bit differently and a little bit ahead of others. But certainly a really challenging and rewarding and exciting time to be able to be part of what I know the word transformational it's overused, but it kind of feels like we're transforming the way that we do day to day and the way that we use technology for care.
Yeah, these are certainly very interesting times in healthcare right now. You talked about the growth of automation and of course AI, machine learning, right? Machine learning to manage those vast data pools of patient data. But with all of that data out there, how is that impacting the threat service? And I want to direct that to Mark, because I know this is an area that you focus quite extensively on, Mark. How is this new technology, this new presence, this threat surface in healthcare, how is this impacting the overall security of the industry?
I mean, it obviously expands the threat profile, right? And I think this is something when we always think about risk, we think about the sophisticated threat actors and the bad guys, and I'll talk about them in a second. And we don't think about the emerging technology, right? We don't think about the fact that we've moved data to the cloud, that we now have people accessing that remotely, and we've sort of shifted from that traditional kind of on-premises perimeter-based model. So as Anahi said, for an institution which is sort of far more, is more ahead and proactive in that respect, to some degree, it's a little bit of business as usual. For those that aren't, COVID, for example, created a massive shift. And we see certainly as well in those sorts of environments, we see actors that take advantage of uncertainty and volatility, right? So the threat actors like the nation states, and while we used to write them off and sort of think, look, why would they go after businesses like ours? The reality is they do. We feel the sort of the aftershocks of major tectonic political events. There are organized criminal gangs. They work in an ecosystem and an economy that is well structured, well organized. So things like ransomware as a service. In fact, groups like Maze and Our Evil and Soden will actually sell their name. And we've seen events like that where they know as they go after specific institutions, they realize if they see Maze, which they've read about, they're more likely to pay. It's more voracious. So it's not just ransoms now. We see plays for massive operational disruptions, as we've seen in healthcare. We're now talking 6-7 figure types of ransoms. And on top of that, we're also seeing extortions. And on the flip of that, of course, we also had Treasury that popped out late last year and said, by the way, before you pay those ransoms, make sure that those recipients aren't on the OFAC list. Otherwise, you're now violating two major laws, one of them being trading with the enemy. So those kind of guardrails get harder or narrower. And we have to struggle with the limited resources we have and recognize that what we have has to go against non-automated types of attacks. So hands on keyboard, using pre-stolen information, multi-pronged types of attack that come in through multiple vectors that infect multiple systems before there's any kind of metastasization or to the point where it manifests as a sign or a symptom and we know we're now under threat.
Right. Yeah, these are big concerns, and obviously, the SolarWinds attack, the Microsoft Exchange attack, are indicators of the growing rise of nation-state actors, right, out to either steal intellectual property, to gain intelligence, cyber espionage, or to outright, steal valuable healthcare information. Is this something, Dave and Anahi, that you're seeing amongst the CEOs of hospitals? Do they have increased awareness and concern around this rising threat vector?
I would say absolutely. They've got increased awareness that they see, it's out there and published that other health systems are going through this. I think, within the past 5-10 years, it's, security and privacy is something that's much more discussed within the boardroom of health systems and has to be.
Right.
Yes, I would agree. In fact, just today, this morning, I met with the board, and when putting together the agenda, the chair of the board asked me specifically, can you cover and do a comparative analysis of the major issues that are happening in the headlines and how that has affected Christiana Care, and if it has not, why not? And if it had, what would we have done about it? Very specific, very well thought out and educated questions from a non-cybersecurity industry board member, and what they're looking to learn and understand. So I think that is very demonstrative of how senior leadership has really become attuned to the major headlines and to the threat landscape, and how they're now really wanting to understand from an impact perspective, how can we be analytical about our exposure and our risk? Right.
So what can HDOs like Christiana Care do to address these risks? We've mentioned, and we all know that there are limited budgets, limited tools, limited staff, but we're now being asked to defend against the Russian GRU, a military intelligence unit, right, and the Chinese Hafnium, one of the Chinese PLA cyber espionage units. How can organizations like that defend themselves? What do we need to do to address these risks?
Well, so I think as we engage in conversations with leadership and executive management, where we're asking for those budgets, those resources, and garnering that support, I think we need to be very deliberate. I also think we need to be very authentic in terms of having the conversations and educations around the threat landscape, why healthcare is such a target, what that means to our organization, but not make promises in terms of, if you give me X number of budgets, we're going to stop nation state threat actors. I think we need to be truly authentic around the fact that an organization of our size, albeit large in terms of healthcare delivery organizations in the country, are still no match for Russia and China. And although we can take many steps to perhaps avoid being the next attack, it does not guarantee that we will ever have the arsenal at our disposal to be able to stave off an attack if it's very deliberate. And so in terms of positioning ourselves to have a chance at combating some of these risks, we need to consume threat intelligence. We need to make sure that we're getting the basics around patch management and vulnerability management. We need to get really, really good at that. I mean, that has to be one of our best competencies. And when I walked through the threat landscape this morning with our board, I demonstrated how a lot of what has happened has been the result of unpatched systems, perhaps not specifically in the SolarWinds attack, but WannaCry. The exchange vulnerability is being exploited actively by the Chinese and now by ransomware threat actors who We're going after the systems that were compromised by the Chinese. Well, this patch has been out for over a month at this point. So why is this still a problem? And so not only do we need to be really good at that cyber hygiene, we need to do risk management well, but we also need to make sure that we're really adept at incident response so that if something happens, we can actually manage and minimize the impact to the organization, potentially to patient care, by being prepared to respond when the thing that we can't stop actually does happen.
Right. I think I was going to say, sorry, I've got a bit of an echo there, but I was going to say, yeah, it's no longer a question of if you get hacked, but it's a question of when you get hacked and how badly, right? So, you know, these are all concerning. Were you trying to say something there, Mark, as we transitioned?
I was just going to add there that I think if we sort of bookend this at the front end, what Anahi talked about with risk management, right? So going through the kind of the prioritization of the various risks or the most likely scenarios that the institution would face, mapping those out so that you know from the spend, as you said, right? These are the things we can cover. Here's what this looks like, and here's what we can't. And on the other end of that is incident response. And when going through that, I see a lot of organizations struggle sometimes getting the attention of the non-technical executive. And it's critical that they be a part of it so that they understand that not every decision is an IT decision, right? That there really is a business risk to manage, not an IT problem to solve, and figuring out where those roles, responsibilities play, just the same way that you go through some other simulation in a healthcare related incident, or let's say like a power outage, a fire, floods, things like that. Do the same thing so that you're tried and tested, and you hope some muscle memory kicks in. I realize in these situations, they're horrific when you face them, and everyone, I think, downplays the emotional factors, right? Suddenly you're the executive on the hook. You have to go in front of the press. You're being challenged, or a regulator's, coming knocking, whatever it might be. It's not quite the same thing over, sandwiches in a boardroom when you practice, but at the same time, it's better to have a plan than it is to suddenly try to figure out, what is it, how do we dial 911 and who should we call and so on.
Yeah. And Dave, I know you've probably seen quite a lot of I was going to say panic, but a lot of activity around BCP DR over the last year when COVID hit, right? Staff were all sent home. Non-clinical staff were all sent home, with the exception of a few stalwarts like Anahi. But the vast majority of people were working remotely, and we face some different challenges, right?
Sure. I mean, you've got a lot of the patient access center, customer service reps that are going to be doing calls and communications from their home. Is how do you secure that? I think that's something every health system had to go through. Is how do you get those folks up and running in a secure manner and be HIPAA compliant? There's a lot to take in, and those aren't necessarily scenarios that we've run through, often as we go through and have our policies and procedures in place.
Yeah, interesting times. But, I want to come back to Mark's point about risk. Do you think that hospitals really have a good understanding of all the risks they're subjected to? Do they know the assets that connect to their network? Particularly now that, we've got a lot of medical devices connecting to networks. We've got a lot of AI systems on our networks, particularly around clinical decision support, right, in radiology, for example, which is an area that's grown very very quickly over the last 4 or 5 years, right? And do we have a good understanding of the risks that each of those devices pose? I'm thinking particularly in terms of the third-party vendor risk threat here, right? I mean, we saw that with the Orion case of third-party software that was used on our network that we didn't necessarily have too much visibility into. We've now got so much that we use from so many different vendors. This is an extremely complex situation, right? And I'll open that to all three of you at the same time.
I would agree certainly with Orion SolarWinds and the Microsoft Office 365 events that we've seen in the last couple of months, that that brings a focus back to supply chain. And I think in a lot of cases, supply chain is grossly overlooked. And as you think of things like wearable devices, right, nomadic kind of devices, so patient telemetry and so on, that goes on and off of the network. Again, we generally have a business that makes a decision. We put those into place. We make deals with suppliers, and we don't necessarily measure the risk, and we don't do the due diligence to understand what risks they do represent. And that certainly becomes more challenging when you deal with SolarWinds or Microsoft or an Amazon, because they're not going to take your DDQ and go through it and give you thorough answers. There's a certain amount of trust you have to put in place, which I think is why you have to come back to an assumption that there will be a supply chain event, and what's your response to it, and how do you deal with that as part of your incident planning and as part of your risk registry.
Yeah, but we've had supply chain events in the past, Mark, right? I mean, let's look at it. NotPetya was a classic
For sure.
case, right?
100%.
Yeah. And yet we get clobbered again by the exact same attack vector.
Yeah, because I think from a business perspective, right, we ink the contract, and after the fact, we chuck it over the fence to somebody in IT or in security and say, here you go, figure out how to deal with this, right? So we didn't actually proactively look at what the risks were, what the consequences were, determine what the indemnification is by both parties, look at what roles and responsibilities were, duties of care. I mean, a lot of what I've seen with supply chain is down to things like patching and vulnerabilities where the contract's signed to to install and configure and not to maintain. And so the customer thinks that it's being maintained by the managed service provider, as an example, and it's not, right? Because they didn't sign for that, but the assumption is there and the ball falls between both players.
Right. Is that something you're seeing, Dave? Are customers, in the healthcare space, getting more vigilant over their third-party contracts?
I think, and you're seeing a lot more players that are coming into the market. I mean, as health systems are trying to drive the outcomes with like multi-channel communications and using AI to drive next best actions and close gaps in care. There's more players that are coming into this and need to be vetted out as far as how they're going to impact from a security perspective.
Right. So a question for Anahi, since you're on the cutting edge here, are individual hospitals, and state governments now too small to take on these perpetrators of cybercrime? I mean, we're up against the Russian GRU and the Chinese PLA, right? There seems no way that a small state, or a small hospital could possibly compete against this. Do we need federal government intervention here? Do we need collective defense? Do we need better information sharing beyond what we're getting out of the Healthcare ISAC right now?
Philosophically, is the government prepared to respond and protect
That's a bigger question, right?
from some of these threats? I mean, I think that the sophistication of nation state actors is to a level that it's nearly impossible for small and mid-sized or even large healthcare organizations to really be able to protect against some of these emergent threats. Information sharing must always be part of what we do. And, the role that HISAC plays is integral to the success of an industry collectively. And also organizations like the Healthcare Coordinating Council and the work that they're doing in terms of the products that they're putting out there that can help the smaller and the mid-sized organizations and trying to work through how to implement standards, the work that MITRE's doing. And there are a lot of different organizations that are going to need to collectively band together in order to be able to help the industry solve for some of these problems and have a small fighting chance of protection against these sophisticated nation-state-backed threat actors. I don't believe that just looking to the government and saying, please help us, you need to invest more in us, is the right solution. I think as an industry collectively, we need to look to these expert organizations that have a stake in helping the industry as part of the collective fabric that's going to help the industry as a whole.
Right. Mark, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you're right. What level of government intervention we're going to get, I'm not sure, but some amount of air cover would certainly be well supported, because there's a lot of these events happen in the wild that you know upstream, they see indicators, they see movements, they know something's coming. So what can they do at that point to kind of stem it before it hits? Because, if we quote from the movie Jaws, right, you're going to need a bigger boat. And in fact, in other industries, I've actually seen this where smaller businesses like business services, law firms, accounting firms, engineering firms are literally saying, my malpractice insurance is going through the roof. I've got to figure out how to effectively merge my practice with someone else, because as a small entity, we can't afford to do this. We can't buy enough cyber insurance. We can't buy enough staff and resources to adequately protect ourselves against the type of threat actors we're now facing. And we see it, unfortunately see day in, day out. So I don't feel that should be the right answer here, right? So it's not just, I think, to threat intelligence sharing, but it's threat response sharing, right? Helping reverse engineer what's happened, providing recommendations, simplified frameworks, like eliminate all the hygiene kind of stuff, right? Like make sure we're patched, make sure you're using multi-factor authentication, some of the fundamental tools we need to put in place so that people, practitioners, I should say, understand why they're there. They're not a nuisance. And maybe that has to be part of the whole CME process, right? In other industries where they have the same kind of provisions, they're now mandating several hours a year has to go to cybersecurity awareness, so they understand what that looks like in context of their business.
Yeah. And a lot of what you talk about there, is general housekeeping, security housekeeping, right? These are things that should be happening already, but we're still chasing it. 15 years or more after HIPAA was written, we're still trying to play catch up here. So. Certainly interesting times. I'm sure Phelan would agree.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's always important to bring the healthcare perspective into everything. I feel like COVID has been this very big gift in that it means that we need your perspective on each and every event, because it's become such front and center. We got some nice comments in the audience. James says he agrees with Mark about the next supply chain event disruption. In response to how to defend against the nation state, Mike said difficult. Folks need a network to help them understand things and also train for this eventuality. But budgets, Lots of great points. But we are now out of time. But this is great. So please thank Richard for moderating yet another fantastic panel. Thank our panelists David, Anahi, and Mark. Please give them a wonderful virtual round of applause.